All right, let's see. Looks like we're live here. Cool. So, Saturday afternoon. I thought I would just hang out and do some mapping. It's been a little while since I've just worked on a map on my own. Kind of miss it. Figured I would just do it on YouTube and see if anyone wants to hang out. I see Federico is here, or Federico. Nice to have you with us. Let's see. Let's start with a little mountain range in here. So what I'm working on right now is on a large campaign world that's been kicking around in the back of my head for a while. And my general concept for it is mostly pre-unification Germany. So lots of small baronies and little warring factions rather than one big United Kingdom. And it's mostly going to be landlocked. So again, it's sort of Germanic, where it's not a lot of intricate coastlines or anything like that. Hi, James. How you doing? James says, thanks for the review of Stars Without Number. Ooh, awesome. Yeah, I'm glad to see that other people are using that. I have yet to do a big sci-fi campaign, but that's definitely something that's going to happen at some point. There are so many resources for that out there right now, not just things like Stars Without Number, but also books like Augmented Reality, like that huge book of random tables that you can use for any sort of sci-fi metropolis. That stuff is awesome. Let's see. So I'm going to have this cluster of mountains near the middle of this big region. That's what I'm kind of working on right now. And I'm going back to just doing these sort of simple, inverted V style mountains. I think it works pretty well, especially when you add a little bit more detail to it. So for example, you just add like a little ridge line going down the side of it. Do a couple of those. Because then you can add little slopes coming off of these. So for example, I don't know if this is going to be the final map for the campaign world, but it's good to just get back in the swing of things again. All right. So once you have these little like ridges built in here, you can do a little bit of shading, which is what I'm going for. So I got these brush pens. I'm going to use a really light one, I think. And then you just shade the right side of the mountain is usually what's best here. For whatever reason, the human eye seems to like that side to be in shadow. It seems to read a little bit better as a mountain. I was reading that somewhere, that cartographers figured that out a while back, but no one's quite sure why it is. Brian Smith, I imagine using multiple jeweler lenses to do those fine details. No, I mean, this isn't that small. Here, I got a ruler so you can see about how big this is. I'm really zoomed in here. So, those are inches right there. So the general scale that I'm going for here is, well, here's how I think about it. When I'm setting up my worlds or setting up a map, I think about how far characters can travel in a day, right? And usually that's about 20 miles or so. It can be a little more than that if you have a really good road. But generally, in good conditions, someone marching for a day will get about 20 miles. I just set that as my average. So in this case, I'm decided to make that 2 inches because that's just really easy. 20 miles is 2 inches. So 1 inch is 10 miles. And that's the scale I'm using. So that seems about right. So for example, this really large mountain right here is about 1/2 inch wide. So that makes it about 5 miles across at the base. And that's about right. I was spending some time today on Google Maps, just zooming in on different mountains and figuring out about how big they are. And a fairly large mountain like Mount Hood in the Pacific Northwest is about 5 miles across at its base. So I'm using that as my standard for a pretty big mountain. And that just sort of brings everything into the right scale. So it's easier to tell how big things are. Let's see. What brand of pen am I using? So I'm using microns to do the fine details, and I'm using these Koi coloring brush pens to do the shading. And I think they are both produced by Pigma. This is put out by Koi, but I think it's by Sakura, and Pigma is also put out by Sakura. You can see it has the same sort of like flower logo there. So really it's the same company. They work really well. If you shop around on Amazon for a bit, you can get packs of these for relatively cheap. Certainly a lot cheaper than they would be buying them in a store. Guido says, one thing I can't find a way of doing in a satisfying way is shadows, especially mountains, but also forests and other geography. Cool if you make a video on different techniques. So yeah, I mean, to do shadows, I just use like these brush pens, right? That seems to be the most effective way of doing it. Let's see here. Oh, that was the wrong shade of, I thought that looked a little dark. That's okay. Just happy accidents, right? There we go. And that seems to work out pretty well. So for a while, I was doing this forest technique where I was using a brush pen and just making these little dabs on the page, on these little black tree shapes. And then I was using a very light brush pen to sort of make these little shadows underneath each tree. It was fairly time consuming. 1 second, I think I have a copy of it over here. Well, no, I don't. Turns out this is just a map of just different techniques I was trying out. So those are the sort of trees I'm talking about. And what I was doing is I was just taking each of the little trees and I'm just putting like a little diagonal shadow underneath it like that. Right, and just makes them pop a little bit more. It's fairly time consuming though. I'm not really doing that so much anymore. If you're really zoomed in to the map, then it might be worth it. It makes the trees look more like icons and less like the texture of trees. So it's kind of a trade-off. Let's see other questions. How hyped am I for Frostbitten and Mutilated? Yeah, I'm pretty hyped. I've seen the preview pictures of what that thing looks like inside. It is pretty fantastic in terms of Zach's art. It's what everyone normally expects, I think. Let's see. One of the nice thing about microns is that they're waterproof. Really? Are they waterproof? That would be pretty cool. I mean, I've never actually tried it. I haven't spilled water on them or anything yet. But they are really nice. They're nice and dark. They're very thin. It's really easy to handle. Guido says, I like to doing a lot of lines on one side to add shadows and textures at the same time. Yeah, I've done that a little bit too. So you can get like, let me get another example here. So if you just draw, so I got some little mountains right over here. This whole page was just like me testing out random stuff. So I don't know, maybe it's useful for you guys. And then you get a thin little pen. Let's get a number 1, for example. And then you can just, right, you can add like the texture of the mountain. That's not very good. More just like the slope of the mountain and so on. So you can add like, the roughness of the texture. It's hard to get it to look right. You need to spend a lot of time. And a lot of my techniques are just trying to find a way to make this as simple and straightforward as possible. Let's see. Have you read any works by Jesse Bullington? Dark fantasy set in medieval Germany. Jesse, no, that sounds really familiar. Jesse Bullington. What's the name of some of his books? I may have read some of them before, or have read part of them before. Sorry if there's a little bit of background noise. I've got stuff happening in the background, but that's the way it goes when you're going live. Brian asked, question, how do you present a map like that, like the bigger one, to your players? So this is mostly for me. I mean, if I was going to use this to actually put on the table, which would be pretty cool, this map, I wouldn't have too much of a problem with that, because my concept for this campaign world is that it is a large, civilized, fairly settled area. It's kind of a trope in D&D to have like a small bastion of civilization and then have like howling wilderness outside of that. So I thought it would be a nice change to have just a large kingdom that's fairly well settled, and there's like patches of wilderness, of forests and just desolate wasteland sort of in there, right? If you go up into the mountains, you'll find that. But most of the land is pretty well settled and well known. So there's lots of cities, lots of towns. I thought that would be a nice change. So for a map like that, I don't think it would be a big deal to give it to the players, because I think that you could assume that they would know where everything is. And then you could just not put on the map the more secret or interesting things, right? And then have the players slowly discover those over time. The Sad Tale of the Brothers Grossbart. Yeah, okay, I have heard of that book. I started reading another one of his books, and something of the world. I can't remember now, but it was set in like the Netherlands or something like that, when there was like a big flood and a lot of the cities were underwater, and they had to like dig up this treasure that was buried in a house that was just underneath the surface. That was pretty cool. Yeah, I really like the tone of those books. They're quite dark and graphic, but it really had a Lamentations of the Flame Princess feel. The Folly of the World. That's it. Thanks for reminding me. All right, let's keep going on these mountains here. I need more mountains. Let's sort of go off in this direction. Normally when I'm doing a map like this, I'm just putting on like a podcast in the background or something like that. And then you just sort of draw to your heart's content and just zone out. It's a lot of fun. You can even get a lot of detail in. So I'm sort of doing trees now where my forest look more like, let's see if I can zoom in here. Look more like this now. I really like the little inverted V's for like lots of little pine trees, but that does take a while, but it's not a big deal if you have something going on in the background. It's kind of therapeutic. All right, so let's sort of get some more of these ridge lines going on here. Just going back and forth. You can have them going over to the left, going over to the right. Makes them look a little more three-dimensional. Sort of add the slopes in later. we go. Okay, that's pretty good. Consummate V's, consummate V's. Yeah, I think of that whenever I start drawing mountains and forests. It's always been a sad fact that Strong Bad isn't, his site isn't updated as much anymore. Although he does, I think, have a YouTube channel where he does, he has a Skills of an Artist series, which is pretty funny. All right, let's get some more shading in there. All of these shades of shading pens are all very similar, so it's hard to make sure that you get the exact right one that's the right shade of, light colored. What kind of paper do I use? Asks Jules. This is like, I don't use fancy paper. There's really no need to. This is just a big piece of poster board that I got at Target. I think you can get them in packages of like 5 or 10 for a couple dollars. It's dirt cheap. It's really not a problem at all. I just stock up on it every once in a while. And then, for little maps, I normally use like printer paper, though occasionally I'll use cardstock. Again, you can just buy that in bulk. It's not very expensive. See, James Enders says, reminds of old fairy tales. Kingdoms everywhere with dark woods and swamps dotted about with evil witches. Very German. Yeah, that is my feel. Well, a lot of this was inspired by playing The Witcher 3, which I haven't finished yet. But I really like the main, I'm not sure, the main map, the main area that you're in, which just has a whole bunch of little towns scattered all over the place, connected with this web of roads and a couple large cities in there. But there are parts of it that are really taken over by bandits or monsters, and you need to clear them out. I really like that setup. It makes the map a lot more interesting, and it adds for way more non-monster encounters. So you can still do monster stuff, but most of the things people are going to be running into are humans. And that fits with the way I like to run my campaigns. I prefer my PCs to be all human. I'm not a big fan of having a big party of elves and dwarves where we have this cosmopolitan fantasy thing. I mean, obviously, a lot of people enjoy that. But I find that the whole elves and dwarves and orcs tends to just be stereotypes that people use. Like instead of fleshing out who their character is, they decide I'm just going to be a dwarf, for example, because that sort of takes the burden off me in terms of what my character is going to be like. But if everyone is just people, then I feel like your players tend to dig more into what their characters are actually like, and they tend to relate to other people more to the NPCs more. Like they actually talk to them and deal with them like people. And I really like that dynamic. There's a lot of questions here. Let's see. Are there any book series that deal with specifically with dungeon crawling in the OSR style? That's a good question. I don't know if there really is. I don't know if it would make a really great novel, to be honest, because OSR dungeon crawling is very much, it's just what the players want to do, is motivated by greed, and it's motivated by delight in solving difficult problems and coming out on the other side. So there's a very, I'm not sure what the right word is. There's a mechanical aspect to it, where it's about finding a problem and overcoming it. And that can be interesting, and it can generate stories. But OSR games are random and chaotic enough that they wouldn't necessarily make for a great narrative, I don't think. Narrative sort of is the end result of having a good session. It's not what you're really setting out to do when you're playing. Other questions. The books written by Holmes back in the day of a very OSR style. I'm not sure which Holmes you mean. I know that there was a Holmes in the Appendix N. That sounds really familiar, but I'm not sure which one you mean. Brian Smith recommends Fighting Fantasy Death Trap Dungeon. Choose Your Own Adventure books. Oh, yeah. So Fighting Fantasy. I just got into these recently. Well, actually, I haven't read them, but I heard about them recently because I recently did a review of Troika, which is a retro clone of the Fighting Fantasy role-playing game system. So for those of you who haven't seen it, Fighting Fantasy used to be a series of Choose Your Own Adventure books, except you had to roll up a character, and your character's stats mattered throughout the adventure. I thought that was really cool. In the comments of that video, a lot of people were flabbergasted that I hadn't heard of Fighting Fantasy, but I had honestly never heard of it until I looked into Troika. It just, I don't know. I mean, I'd heard of Choose Your Own Adventure books. Those are pretty well known. maybe it's more of a British thing. I don't know. I've never seen them in the US, never run into them in a bookstore. No one has ever mentioned them to me. So I don't know. One of those weird gaps in my RPG knowledge, I guess. Vera says to try Mifrog is good. Mifrog does not look good from where I am standing, but it looked way too crunchy, and I'm not really interested in supporting Varg. So I have a question from Guido. Are you interested in supporting indie or reviewing indie books from outside the OSR scene? I've been getting a lot of questions about that recently. Let me get back to drawing here. Getting sidetracked. I've been getting a lot of questions about that recently, and I've been getting a lot of people emailing me asking me to review their books, which I get. But man, there's no way I can even keep up with all the stuff coming out of the OSR. And there's a lot of really good stuff coming out on like a weekly basis. I'm totally behind on all the stuff I have to review. I still have a giant stack of books. I did 2 reviews this week, but I am still behind. And there's just no way I could also do a lot of other stuff. There would be no time. The reviews themselves obviously don't take a huge amount of time to make, but it's finding the time to sit down and read the whole book and feel like you're doing it justice and that you understand how it works and you have things to say about it. That does take a while. Plus on top of all the other things I have to do. Like this obviously isn't my full-time job. So, and plus like one of the main focuses of this channel, like the reason why this channel exists is to promote the OSR, because there really isn't any big OSR presence on YouTube. And YouTube is one of the main mediums by which people communicate about role-playing games today. So I feel like I'm really trying to fill a gap there and provide that specific service. Although, I mean, a good channel that covers, indie and story game RPGs could be really interesting. I don't know if one of those really exists yet. I know like Adam Coble has a pretty popular channel where he talks about that sometimes, but his is more, general in its coverage. Humongous says humans are usually my favorite enemies to use. Yeah. I mean, if you throw a bunch of goblins at your players, they usually have no qualms about just cutting them down, right? Because they're goblins, right? They're meant to be killed in a D&D frame of mind. But whenever you throw like a bunch of bandits at them or a bunch of, any sort of humans, and then just before fighting actually breaks out, have them start acting like actual people, then suddenly the players will be much more hesitant to kill them. At least that's been my experience, especially if you really play up the impact of their actions. I feel like that really drives home the need to communicate and to use tools in your toolbox other than killing to get through some encounters. I really like the dynamics that sort of brings up. Oh, Holmes of Holmes Basic D&D. Okay, yeah. I didn't know that he wrote any fantasy novels. I just missed out on that, I guess. Yeah, Holmes wrote the first version of Basic D&D before the second edition. Let's see, I have it right here. Let me put it in the map. There we go. I have the second version done by blanking out Moldvay, which I really like. It's really cool. Although I'm really looking forward to the BX Essentials line. So the guy who did the Dolmenwood books, Gavin Norman, is putting out a series of books called BX Essentials, where he takes all of the rules from the whole BX line and condenses them and organizes them and puts them all in one place into a series of booklets. Like one booklet is all the spells, one booklet is all the monsters, and he clarifies them and he clears up any confusions or contradictions, and he reformats them so they're easier to read. They look really cool. So I definitely want to do a review of that at some point. Also, if I could do a video with Scrap Princess and Patrick Stewart, it'd be awesome. Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're in the back of my mind in my list of people that I need to interview. I'd like to do interviews with most of the major OSR people at some point, but it's finding the time to do that. I can usually make 1 or 2 videos a week, is what my time usually allows for. And so I have to sort of split my time up between all the things I want to do. Max Evans, how did you learn to draw all of your maps? I just did it. I've been doing it since I was a little kid. mostly from reading Lord of the Rings and things like that. I started drawing my own maps based on that. And then me and all of my friends, I had like 5 or 6 friends, and we were all really into fantasy. We started creating our own fantasy world and writing novels based on the different countries. So we had this giant continent called Kanara, and each of us had our own country or several countries in my case, and we had stories and plot lines that we were developing for each of them. I think we developed a collectible card game or like a miniature tactical game for fighting out battles within this world. We did a collaborative timeline that was 6,000 years long of all the major events and the different countries that were interwoven together. So that's where I really started doing a lot of map making. And then after that, even when that sort of faded into the background, it was just a thing that I doodled. You know, maps are fun to doodle. Say the Fantastic Four says the original Conan books are great old school type stories. That is absolutely true. They are so good. Definitely underrated. I just picked up the complete collection of all the Conan short stories, and man, you can just open those up to like any of them, and they are just a ton of fun. Like the Tower of the Elephant, I think was the first one that I read, and it reads like a D&D story, like a really good D&D story, where he has to like get into this tower because there's a wizard there and maybe there's treasure and there's a bunch of obstacles in his way. But each time he overcomes them, mostly through like getting smart and using his intelligence to find his way around the monsters or to defeat them in unusual ways. And then there's a twist at the end where the treasure isn't what he thought it was going to be. It's really cool. I really love those stories. Let's see. Okay, that's enough mountains for now. Let's go into doing a little bit of forests. Forests are a bit of fun. You just do little consummate Vs, like so. And you make them small enough that it's easy to tell that they're not intended to actually be literal individual trees. It's more like you're building up a texture that looks like a forest, right? It's easier to tell that that's the intent. I think it's pretty effective once you have a lot of it, especially. And because it's sort of broken into these little Vs, into these little parts, then it's much easier to do things like, right, you can put it in between all the mountains like this. So you can show where the trees are. You can show density pretty easily. And honestly, doesn't take much longer than doing that other trick where I would just use the brush pen and just kind of dab it. This doesn't really take much longer. Let's see if I can move the camera over a little bit. There we go. That's better. Tom says, yeah, I've heard of the Conan stories and Far from the Grey Mouser. Yeah, those are really good too. I have read a lot fewer of the Grey Mouser stories than I have of the Conan stories, although I own them all. I have this big stack of Appendix N books on my shelf that I need to slowly work through. But fortunately, they're all short stories, so you can really just sort of go through them at your own pace, right? So I want to have a lot of these dense, dark forests sort of up in the mountains that players can push into. Because you can have the idea that, you know, the forests are somewhat alive and malicious and keep pushing in against this civilization that has mostly filled up this area. Also, having a map that's mostly made out of civilized areas, like lots of little towns and networks of villages and cities, makes your map a lot more interesting to look at because you can put borders and roads and trade routes and villages and stuff like that. Whereas if you're just drawing a really big wilderness, it can be awfully hard to make all of the space look interesting rather than just being a lot of, you know, blank space full of grass. That can be a problem. It'll just look kind of boring. You feel the need to keep putting in more and more features when you don't really need to. See, so the cool thing about this is that you can create like kind of a mountainous or a foresty mountain area, which is a little bit hard to do in other circumstances. You can even put like a couple trees on the mountain itself, right? A couple trees here and there. Don't put them up too high because, mountains have a tree line. Trees can't grow above a certain altitude. You can sprinkle them here and there. Far the Grey Mouser stories on YouTube, narrated by James Earl Jones. Holy cow, that sounds amazing. I have to check that out. I mean, I'll listen to anything narrated by James Earl Jones. Let's see. Tom says Lone Wolf, the original tabletop RPG, not the newest one, was actually the first RPG I ever played. That's cool. Lone Wolf. I don't know if I've heard of that one. Is that like Lone Wolf and Cub? That's a manga series, isn't it? Or are you talking about something different? Another viewer says, that kind of reminds me of a game, tabletop-like, where each player made their own country. Ooh, later made my own similar game, but with 4 players, not 12. Yeah, so I mean, that's, I guess, a little bit like Diplomacy. That's a game where you're playing your own country, more or less. And well, at least you're playing diplomats from your own country, trying to backstab each other and form alliances. So that's a thing you can do. And from what I understand, Matt Koval's book projects are going to be pushing into that territory, right? He's doing the Strongholds and Followers right now, which has made almost $2 million, and I think is ending in a day or two. And then sometime after that, he's planning to do, what was it called? Armies and Warfare? Something like Kingdoms and Warfare, I think it's going to be called, where he's going to expand D&D to where you can actually start ruling kingdoms and start playing on a very high level, which is super cool, especially since he's writing those rules for 5th edition, I think. Because that's a very old school style of playing the game, where the assumption was you would eventually build a castle and just move up to higher levels of, domain planning instead of dungeon delving. And it's cool that that sort of attitude is being taken back to 5th edition, because it really just opens up the game. And I think it really focuses. I'm trying. What's the best way to say this? See, okay, so D&D can be tons of different things. One of the best things about D&D is that it is not really focused on one particular thing. It's more like a combination of several different games that are all just sort of cobbled together. I think there's a sense in which D&D is really more like a folk tradition than an actual game, because it's just sort of an activity that people do, and they cobble things onto it or take things off depending on what their particular table needs. So I like that more of these systems are being built up that give people more options. Andrew from Dawnforge Cast is here. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for stopping by, man. Diplomacy ruins friendships. Yeah, that's what I've heard. I've never actually tried to play Diplomacy myself. It sounds dangerous, because you really have to have very clear ground rules that we are going to be betraying each other. That has to be assumed and known from the start, that everyone will betray someone. And you have to be okay with that before you're playing it. And it's really hard for people to put, their feelings aside. Andrew asks, do you think that people using Photoshop stamps and brushes take away from the artistry of map making? No, I mean, it's just another tool. I've definitely thought about getting into Photoshop and figuring out a way to do that myself, but it's really time consuming to learn a whole nother program. I still need to learn how to do InDesign, because I want to get better at book layout in case I make like a bigger RPG at some point. I have lots of different plans for that sort of thing, but InDesign would be a higher priority for me than Photoshop. But those who do Photoshop, I mean, it's just another tool. You can create effects with that you can't with a pen, or would be incredibly time consuming with a pen. So I don't begrudge people doing that at all. I really like some of those maps. Let's see. Lone Wolf was an old book series by Joe Dever. The Kai are basically fantasy Jedi. That sounds cool. Dawnforge Cast, a board game you've never played? Yeah. Well, I have played a lot of board games, but not nearly as many as some people. Trust me. I mean, I've sold off about half of my board games, and I still have, let's see, like, I don't know, a good 20, 25 on my shelf here. That's because I'm pretty ruthless about cutting down my board collection into just the games that I really enjoy and I'm going to play consistently. But I know people out there who have entire rooms of their house that are just nothing but wall-to-wall board games. So I'm nowhere near as hardcore as some people. Are your MSS? Andrew wants to know, are his paint maps a little better or way better? They're way better, Andrew. There's no way I can match your MS Paint skills. In fact, it's actually pretty cool to see MS Paint kind of coming back. I know some fantasy artists, Matthew Adams, I think, who just uses MS Paint to do his art. And it's actually kind of a cool effect. It's all pixely, but he uses that to his advantage. So, I mean, you can use anything as a tool, if you're creative enough. Let's push the forest out this way a little more. You know what? I think I want to have like some rivers kind of coming down in this direction. So I think I'm going to put the rivers in first and then put some forest around it, because that way they won't get in each other's way. So the question is, correct pen size for rivers. 1 is too small, so let's go with 3s. 3s are probably fine. Max asked, so I started my first proper D&D campaign a few weeks ago. I decided to go for an evil campaign. They all seem pretty happy with it. None of them killed each other yet. Any tips? I've never played an evil campaign. I mean, well, I don't know if that's true. It could be that all of my campaigns have been evil because all of my players are evil. But it depends on what your priorities are, if ever and what exactly your boundaries are. So when you say an evil campaign, what are players allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? Do you have any limits in the game where they're not allowed to do such and such? Like, is genocide okay? Right? You got to set boundaries so things don't go too crazy, or it doesn't make anyone super uncomfortable. But if everyone's fine with it, then everyone's fine with it. It can be tricky. So basically, you're saying that they're all really self-interested in terms of evil. I think that's totally fine. I mean, most of my players are very self-interested. Like the OSR style of game tends to run on self-interest, really, in terms that it assumes that players are going to just be out there for the gold and getting treasure. So it's based on greed, essentially. So I guess that's evil in some sense. But greed is a nice motivation when it comes to driving player behavior, and it causes players to be much more self-motivated. So I think that can be a good thing in terms of making your game easier to run. Cryo Shakespeare asks, have you ever played in a non-fantasy, fully historical setting? No, I have not. In fact, it's been a really long time since I've played in any games at all. I mostly just run games. And that's been fairly generic fantasy stuff, just because I'm mostly running it for kids and I have very short periods of time in which to run it. I run games 2 to 3 times a week at this point. But a pretty strict historical or just historical setting, non-fantasy, would be really fun. I know that Lamentations of the Flame Princess is really pushing in that direction. Obviously, there's fantasy elements in Lamentations, but their new core book, which may come out at some point in the next year, I don't know, is going to be very strictly like 14th century Europe, right? With crazy evil magic in the background, but all of the history of our world is going to be present in it. And it's just going to have little twists on it. So I'm actually really looking forward to that, because our world has way more detail and crazier things that have happened in it than anything you can come up with in fantasy. And you can go into it in an infinite depth, right? If you get really into that setting, you can just do a bunch of historical research and find endless layers of things to add to your campaigns. The forever GM struggle is real. Yeah, I don't really mind it. I'm getting better at GMing, so that's a good thing. I'm getting better at improving. I run my games pretty much 100% improv, based on just like a lot of notes that I steal from the internet and random tables and just a couple ideas I have in the back of my head. So I really enjoy doing that, and so that's good practice for me. Humongous says, I've been trying to flesh out my own weird Western system for a campaign. That seems popular. I know there's been a couple of Western themed RPGs that have come out recently. And that makes sense, right? Because if you think about the structure of Dungeons and Dragons, it's basically a Western. right? That's the structure. Like you're a bunch of roaming drifters traveling from town to town, solving problems, killing bad guys, and then moving on after you get the reward. Like you're bounty hunters in a Western, right? And even the setting, which is mostly like some civilization, but you're on the edge of civilization, you're pushing off into the wild, onto the frontier. Again, very Western. Andrew from Dawn Forge Cast says, forever GMing ain't so bad when you get paid for it. That's true. I mean, I get paid for it too. I get paid about like, what, $50 an hour? I also get paid by the school to run the after school clubs. So yeah, I don't mind it. All right, let's get some rivers going here. Go off in that direction. And then we're gonna have a lot of tributaries. There we go. Mostly coming out of the mountains, but we're gonna have, a couple streams just sort of coming off surprising directions. So it's going to just go off in this direction. Where it's going, we don't know. We'll find out later. You don't need to figure out everything right away. You can just sort of have things develop naturally. Brian Smith has a question. When you draw out a town on the map, do you just make a generic town place and describe its features later? Yeah, I mean, when I'm working on this map in particular, I'm probably just going to put town markers. I'm not really going to flesh them out much at all, at least not worry about them at the time. I'm seriously considering just creating generators that are going to generate town features so that I can just put towns on the map. And then as players arrive at them, I can quickly generate what they're like because that makes them a lot more varied and it keeps me surprised, which I really enjoy. I like being surprised by what happens and what the world is like and having to adapt to it. It stops me from getting too fixated on one possible outcome or one possible situation. The situation is always changing. The world is always changing. It keeps me more in my role as a referee rather than as like some sort of grand storyteller, which is really how I prefer it personally. Andrew says, rivers don't fork in your fantasy world. That's right. Rivers never fork. No forking of the rivers. The main trick is just to keep in mind at all times what direction your water is going in, right? So like these rivers are all connected in all sorts of different ways, but the water is always going right in this direction. So as long as that all works out, you're fine. No big deal. Don't fork your rivers. Doesn't happen. I think it happens like once or twice on Earth. I think there's like a Wikipedia page just for like the 1 or 2 rivers where that happens. It's so rare. So out of the millions and millions of rivers and streams, like 2 of them fork. It's basically a crazy abnormality. It just doesn't happen in the real world. How many rivers are too many? There's no such thing as too many rivers. It depends on how granular you want to get, right? If you want to do every stream and little riverlet, then there's going to be just your whole map's going to be covered with them. It can be really instructive to go online and look up some of these maps that people have made of, for example, like every river in the United States. There's one of those that I really like. And it literally has every single river marked out and like drawn in bright blue over a map of the United States. And you can zoom in pretty close. And if you look at it, they're just everywhere. It's super dense. It's like this really dense like vein system. It looks a lot like the actual human circulatory system, actually. And so it really depends on how much detail you want to put in there. Just major rivers, just smaller ones, or whatever. Crowd Shakespeare asks, I don't know if you know much about it, but I think it would be interesting to play a game in a world generated by Dwarf Fortress's World Generation. Yeah, you're not the first person to bring that up. Some people were talking about that on Google Plus recently, where they're talking about how much of the world can you randomly generate? Can you create a script or a program that you can just stick all of the random tables into? Because there is an enormous number of really excellent random tables, like D100 random tables, all over the internet that covers virtually everything you would need to know about D&D, like monsters and villages and forests and rivers and everything. Can you stick that all into like some big program that would generate a whole world? And then you can, tweak it as you needed to. I think that'd be really cool. And I know the Dwarf Fortress does something like that. So it wouldn't be a bad idea. Might be a lot of work to actually use Dwarf Fortress's version, though. Condor says, most players do not care. The gameplay and story matters more. Do not care about what, Condor? Can you clarify? John Targaryen says, how do you fit letters? Right now, I am not worrying about that at all. I'm just doing pure topography. If I was a little more serious about that, I might leave room. Right now, I'm working out just what the world's going to look like. I'm just feeling my way. I mean, one way to do this is to scan or take a picture of this whole thing and then use Photoshop to erase a section and then write word over it. If you wanted to go really physical, you could actually cut out a piece of cardstock and then glue it over this and write its name on it of the mountains or the forests or whatever. And then, take a picture of that. But like I said, I'm not really worrying about it right now. I'm more interested in getting the layout to feel right. And that's more about having a lot of interesting features relatively close together so that no matter in what direction the party decides to walk, there's going to be some sort of interesting geographical feature that will set it apart from what they've seen before. Because you want every direction to feel a little bit different, and you want there to be advantages and disadvantages for every route that they choose to take. Right? So if they're over here and they need to get to a town that's several days away, they should be able to look at the map and see, oh, here's a couple different ways that we could get there. And some of those ways are faster but more dangerous. Some are longer and hence use more resources, but slightly less dangerous. Some might take them past towns that they want to visit. So you want them to be planning and thinking about that and really getting engaged with how they're traveling around the world. If you're into that sort of thing where you're big on player-driven campaigns. Let's put maybe a couple of towns in here. How about that? Move back a little bit. There we go. Jaskmar says, whenever I do lots of rivers, it always looks too messy and busy. Yeah, that can be a problem. It's really just about the level of zoom that you're at, I suppose. If you're zoomed out pretty far, as I am, right? I'm at a zoom level of 10 miles per inch is what I'm doing right now. And at that level, you're not going to want to put in a lot of really small rivers. It'll just take up all your space. Just stick with the main ones. Someone says, if you do prep tables right, you can randomly generate a world with a deck of standard cards. Yeah, that's probably true. Depends on how detailed your generators are. Someone says, Brian Smith says, throw down a handful of cooked spaghetti noodles and connect them all and draw that. Yeah, it's not too dissimilar from what I think I made a review of this a couple years, or a video of this a couple years ago, where it's got a bunch of plastic cubes, little ones. You just sort of throw them on a page and use that as the outline of your continent. So that's sort of like a random generator. It's like a die drop table, like we see in Vorenheim or some other OSR books. Are those little mounds trees? Yes, those are little pine trees, little pointy pine trees. Andrew's off to do his own show. See you later, Andrew. Thanks for stopping by, man. Guido wants to know, have you put any exotic creatures like the ones from Fire and the Velvet Horizon in your games? Which ones and how did it go? Let me think. I don't know if I actually have yet. A lot of them are way too weird to do in the really short sessions that I tend to run. But a lot of them would be really fun, I think. Let me get my copy out and we can look through it real quick. Never mind. I must have put it somewhere with my other books. Oh, well. Yeah, I mean, the ones that pop to mind right away that would be pretty cool are like thug bugs. Thug bugs are great, right? The little bugs that ride increasingly large creatures because you can give them crazy attitudes and they're just really funny and weird and throw everything off, throw the players off in terms of what they expect their enemies to be like. I really like that. All right, let's keep going. Let's put in town. We need a town here. Let's go with size 3 pen. And as we all know, towns are on rivers for the most part, right? They're on because rivers allow you to transport goods and people very easily. A little town there. More like it's a walled town. Let's make that one fairly large, actually. Let's go with a really small pen to get a little bit more detail on it. Let's go this one. Okay. And here's an important fact that I don't know if I've talked about all that much, but towns and villages are close together to one another. You're not going to have a town just out in the middle of nowhere by itself. Most towns aren't going to be more than like 5 miles apart from each other, really. Because if you're much farther than that, then going to the next village and back would be a 10-mile trip, which is like half a day. Most people don't want to be walking for more than half a day. So 5, maybe 10 miles at the very most. With 10 miles, you could get there and back in one day, but it would take up the entire day. That's really pushing it, I think, for most people traveling by foot or by a slow moving horse pulling your wagon. So don't push it much farther than that in terms of how far things are apart. But it's not a big deal for a world like this, which is all fairly densely settled. So let's get a couple more little towns. A little one over there. I think you can spread them out a little bit farther when it comes to rivers because people can travel farther along rivers. But a little place up there. Let's connect them with some roads. And I tend to do just trails of dots for my roads. Here we go. True Nordic. I watch videos like this and instantly want to draw and create an incredible world. I'm not creative at all and can't draw a stick figure. Well, fortunately, I think of my mapping techniques as like the Ed Emberley of map making techniques. If you ever read those Ed Emberley books as a kid, where everything's broken down into just basic shapes. So I try and make everything that I draw basically out of triangles and squares, and circles, just sort of connected in different ways. So, I mean, if you can draw triangles, you can draw forests. If you can draw little rectangles, you can draw towns. It's more about placing them in the right places, I think. And that's mostly just doing a little bit of research on your own in terms of figuring out how these things are structured in the real world. Like, what do networks of villages and towns look like? Pull up maps of medieval Germany and actually look at what those look like. There's some great websites. I'm trying to remember what it's called, like Medieval Demographics Made Easy is, I think, a pretty famous website that just goes into medieval demographics and how they were set up and why they were the way they were. That can be really instructive. And just understanding those underlying patterns of how things were laid out and why they were, you can start making things that look more realistic. And just blatantly steal stuff. I steal stuff constantly from, video games and books I read. Next, Evan says, what edition of D&D do you like to run the best? I'm using 5th edition at the moment, but I've heard 3rd is really good. So 5th edition is obviously the most popular one, and it's fairly straightforward. 3rd edition is significantly more complicated. And then it was revised into 3.5, where they cleaned up a lot of problems with it. And then after that was discontinued, it was revived as Pathfinder. So Pathfinder is essentially 3rd edition D&D. And then in later this year, they're going to be releasing Pathfinder 2nd edition. So if the 3rd edition style is your style of game, I would probably go with Pathfinder, or especially Pathfinder 2nd edition, because that's what's really going to focus on that style of game. And 3rd edition really does focus on detailed character builds and long tactical combat. So you really have to be into those sorts of things to enjoy that type of game. My preferred version of D&D tends to be very simple versions of D&D. So I like BX, the version from the 80s. This one right here, I showed you guys before. And versions that are similar to that. So Lamentations of the Flame Princess is a modernized version of that. I really enjoy that one. I enjoy things like Into the Odd, which is even more simple than that. Any sort of game where I can make a character in 15 minutes or less is probably fine. As well as any game where combat is probably not going to take more than 15 minutes is going to be my sort of game. Because I like combat to be really deadly and really fast. Because the real enjoyment that I get out of the game isn't from the tactical combat. It's from all the things that I do outside of combat. So finding ways around monsters, or convincing monsters to join my side, or setting up traps to kill my enemies, or convincing one faction to fight some other faction, right? So all the creative world manipulation that you can do as a player, that's what I really enjoy about D&D, not the combat so much. So I prefer things that are very simple and allow me to do that sort of thing easily. Let's see. Peter says, greetings from Denmark. First, I would like to thank you for creating awesome content. Well, thank you, Peter. I enjoy making it. I have improved my own map creation as well as DMGM thanks to your videos. Well, that is really great to hear. Thank you. That's very gratifying. Guido says, have I considered telling campaign stories in story format? No, I don't think I'm going to be doing that. I don't know if I would really enjoy doing that, and I don't really like listening to them, so I probably wouldn't be making it. Every once in a while, I'll bring up interesting things that have happened in my home campaign, but I prefer to be playing rather than just talking about those. I have a really hard time enjoying actual plays for the most part. I really gave Critical Role a shot. I listened to a whole episode from their new season where they started all over again. So that was a good entry point. And then I got halfway through the next episode and I just couldn't do it. It's just not my thing. Obviously, those people are having a ton of fun and they are really good at what they do, right? Their voice acting is obviously phenomenal. It's just not my sort of thing. I have a really hard time enjoying watching other people play D&D. So I have yet to find a campaign that's really hooked me in terms of listening to other people do D&D. Humongous says, what's my opinion on OD&D? I have not actually played OD&D as such. I know some people who do play it, and perhaps I should get in one of those games sometime. But I think it would be a lot of fun. I mean, OD&D is one of the ultimate in simple RPG playing, right? The rules are very bare, very minimal. And even in those rule books, it's very clear that you should be making up anything that you want to, right? It says in the OD&D books, like, your players want to be a dragon, they can be a dragon. Just make sure they start off as a little dragon so they can get bigger over time, right? There was a baseline assumption that you as the referee or the dungeon master were going to be homemaking a lot of the stuff. It assumed that you were going to be designing your own dungeons, huge dungeons that were like 7 levels deep and each level had like 50 rooms. It assumed you were going to be doing that, and that you were going to be creating your own mythology, that you were going to just be doing all of this stuff on your own. They really put that in the GM's hands and gave them the responsibility and the trust that they could do that sort of thing. And as a result, like you had to adjudicate a lot of stuff because the rules were so simple. But I like that about it. I like games that put that responsibility in your hands. Tom says, have you any plans for any future actual plays of Maze Rats? Maybe. I mean, I did some Sunday dungeon crawls. I did, I think, 3 or 4 of those a while back. It hasn't really come together again. Like I said, it's hard to get enough people together that that makes sense to do. Not a lot of people really watch those videos, to be perfectly honest. So I'm not really motivated to make more of them. Though who knows, it might happen at some point. I have some friends who do want to start playing again. I'm really looking forward to joining a game sometime soon. I know some people who are starting a new campaign that I would really like to join. So I'm looking forward to being a player at some point in the future. Let's see. Der Kino Dreher says, I'm from Germany and my city is at an old Roman road which connected cities who were between some mountains and flatland made by river, which was in medieval times a wild forest. That's really cool. I mean, a lot of us Americans living in a very new country don't have that experience of living somewhere where there's a lot of history, just like in the roads and in the buildings themselves. So must be nice living in Europe because you can actually experience that directly. Like, we don't have castles just sort of sitting around in our countryside that we can visit. Carl Shakespeare says, it's funny because I'm a gamer who is very much into mechanics heavy stuff, pure systems and strategy games, but I find D&D combat usually the least interesting part. The creativity is the draw. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I really do enjoy detailed tactical combat in my board games, for sure. Games that are really focused on doing that, that is great. Like Space Hulk is one of my favorite games. But what makes D&D special and sets it apart from all those types of games is that you can do anything, and outside of combat, you can get creative in a way that you can't with just, combat tactics. So I prefer my D&D to really double down on the outside of combat creativity because I feel that's what really makes D&D distinct. And it can kind of clash with the rest of the game if you have both of those things going at once. I think that may be one of the problems people had with 4th edition, which was by all accounts, the combat was very good in the sense that it was very clean, very tactical, very strategic. You could really get into it in a way that you couldn't do in 3rd edition. But it was like a completely separate game from the rest of the game, right? Outside of combat wasn't like that at all. Then inside combat is like you pull out a board game and you're playing something different. So I like my D&D to very smoothly transition into combat, make it very brutal and fast and deadly, where it's like, should you even be in this fight? Should you be retreating? And those are the things that are in your mind. And then it's over and you see whether you made a good decision or not. Jaskmar says, what symbol do you use for bandit camps? I guess I'd probably use like a little tent. Let's put a bandit camp on here and see what we get. Bandit camp. Let's use a little marker. Bandits. live in the woods. So here we go. Bandit camp. I suppose instead of a little tent, you could make like a little campfire. I'm not totally sure about the best way to draw that though, so not really going to worry about it. Let's see here. Let's get some hills because I want, you know what, let's expand the forest a little bit. I'm not totally happy with how big this forest is. So let's make it bigger. A little house there. And let's put one a little bit farther away. Let's make like a bigger city. How about right here? Make a big city on the river. A bigger city up there, or a walled city at least. Let's connect them with some roads. There we go. Tom says, I live in Ireland and we are literally lousy with ruined castles, manors, keeps, and underground vaults. It's awesome for RPG nerds like yourself. Yeah, I mean, it would be really easy to do, I guess, LARPing. For sure. You could actually do stuff in a real castle. Bertram Winder says, yeah, there's a stave church near me. Cool. I've always wanted to visit a stave church. My wife and I actually went to Iceland on our honeymoon. We saw a lot of really cool stuff up there that they've been preserving, but we didn't get to go to a stave church. KTZ Plays says, could you do a video on a planned medieval city? Possibly in the future. I mean, for the most part, medieval cities weren't particularly planned. They just sort of had a keep, and then towns would just sort of grow up around them. But there definitely are examples of planned cities. I mean, like the Romans were really into planning cities. So any large empire that got used to putting a city down intentionally would tend to start planning them. Though a lot of medieval ones just didn't end up that way because they tended to slowly evolve over time. Drew Norrick says, I don't know if you're a gamer or not, but have you checked out Kingdom Come Deliverance? Yeah, I have. Well, I don't actually own it yet, but I've definitely been watching some actual plays of it. It looks really cool. It's definitely something that I'm interested in. So basically, it's an open world RPG like Skyrim or whatever, but it's strictly historically accurate. So you're actually set in a particular place in Europe at a particular time. There's no magic, there's no wizards. You're just like a peasant, and you can slowly work your way up and become like a knight or a ruler and so on. That looks really cool because I love that sort of immersion into a fictional world like that. Well, a non-fictional world, I should say. Do you ever make moats around your castle cities? Yeah, I mean, most of them would, if it was at least a keep by itself. If it's a keep sort of inside a city, it's often not really going to have a moat, though, of course, it'll depend. I haven't really drawn a lot of castles per se, so I haven't really thought about it that much. Let's see here. Do you have any video on drawing sparse ice wastelands? Yeah, I would approach it like a desert. I mean, icy wastelands are awfully boring to draw, right? Just like go to Google Maps and zoom in on Antarctica, right? It's just like flat ice going on forever. Not terribly interesting. You'd probably have to label it to make it very clear that it was snow or tundra. I guess you could put like little bits of grass here and there or something like that, but that might end up making it look like a forest. So I don't know. How often do you include gonzo stuff in your games? I tend not to have like a lot of sci-fi stuff in my games, although that can certainly shake things up a lot. My stuff is generally fairly, standard fantasy stuff, but at least when I'm running games for the 10-year-olds that I tend to run games with, I don't worry too much about having things be really consistent in terms of like a fully fleshed out world. I tend to just throw things in there that seem interesting and keep things fairly fresh. I mean, I have robots occasionally, but I mean, the difference between a robot and a golem is academic. So let's put some hills in here. There we go. I do hills. I've taken to just doing a little bit of shading. There we go. A little bit of hills over there. Let's maybe add some more trees on those hills. Do I have a Discord? No, I do not have a Discord. I've been kind of thinking about it. I wonder how popular it would actually be. Would any of you guys actually use a Discord if I had it? I mean, I am subscribed to several Discords, I guess, but I don't really use any of them. It'd be a good place to have like, little discussions and so on. But I'm worried about spreading myself out too thin on the internet. I don't know if that's really something I should be worried about. But I'm mostly on Google Plus. That's where most of my discussions with other people happen. And you guys are all free to join me on Google Plus if you want to. And then I'm on Twitter. That's mostly where I interact with the broader RPG universe. I'm not really on Facebook anymore, mostly because I just kind of hate Facebook. And I'm on YouTube. And I'm on Patreon. And it's just like, and then Discord, it's just like, I'd have to check like 8 different forums a day. I don't know. Let's see. So in Poland, we had problem with Teutonic Knights Order. They had a big thing for planned cities, and they built strongholds 30 kilometers away from each other, because that's the distance of a day walking on foot. Yeah, right. So the distance between things is definitely based on people's walking speed. That's definitely how people think about them. I plan on using the random tables in Maze Rats to name cities. Well, probably not to name cities. I don't have like city naming tables in there, but I definitely use the tables in Maze Rats for all sorts of stuff. Right? And that was their intent, is that you can actually print out the random tables and use them as a GM screen if you want to. They just slide right into a GM screen, and there you go. So I definitely use those all the time. You could have a Discord for discussions, bring people into speaking servers. Yeah, that's true. Nice thing about Discord is your community acts with a lot of each other there. Yeah. I'm wondering what like the focus of my Discord would be. I guess like the focus of Questing Beast is map making like this and old school games. So I guess that could be an interesting discussion platform. See, so by having trees as like these little pointy triangles, you can spread them out a little more if you want to show like a less dense forest. So that's like a nice thing about it. So you can have a road going through this sort of wooded area. It makes this road a little more interesting. True Nordic says, do you have a Twitter? Yes, I do. You guys can all follow me on Twitter. Here, I'll put it in the chat so you guys can see it. There it is. So my Twitter is at Benjamilt, BenJamilt. And just go under the name Questing Beast there. A big inspiration for this map and for the idea of it is definitely inspired by Warhammer and the Empire in general. I really like the feel of that. Although the Warhammer fantasy role-playing games tend to be a little too heavy for me, personally. Let's have this river feed down into a lake. How about? Shift my stuff up a little bit. There we go. Using a size 3 pen. There we go. All right, let's do a lake down here. There we go. And then the river just continues to flow out the other side. Off in that direction. A little island in the river there. Crowd Shakespeare. I really like the idea of these and making them, but I'm so impatient. Yeah, you got to find a way to make it so that you're not in a hurry to finish the map, right? Have stuff going on in the background. If I was just drawing this in this room by myself without chatting with you guys or having like a podcast on or something like that, I'd probably go crazy. So I really have to have my attention elsewhere so that I can just, you know, go with the flow. Otherwise, it's almost impossible. Do you have any plans to make a video going through the process of making a scenario using maze rats? I've been thinking about doing more stuff with maze rats recently, at least making videos about it, because it has all those random generators in it. And I only really had a video on generating a character. So I thought it'd be fun to do a video like randomly generating a monster and then like doing a city and other stuff like that. In terms of like actual scenarios, like I don't tend to think of like big scenarios, like with a lot of work put into them. Instead, what I tend to think of is creating an area, like a zone, maybe like a small 6-mile hex or something, and then putting a bunch of interesting things going on in them. So little encounters. So like some people fighting, or, you know, someone is starving to death, or someone, there's like a small battle going on, or maybe there's like a parade happening or like a procession happening down one road to like a part of the forest where something's going on. or maybe there's like a bandit camp that is, trying to push into the area, and they're just like besieging a small town. And like, there's a lot of little things happening all over the place. So that's how I tend to think of setting up a game. And then when I plot players down in the middle of the area, they just sort of wander around and interact with the stuff. And then as they interact with it, it starts snowballing, and all of the things start interacting with them, and then start interacting with each other. And then like all the connections just start happening on their own, and the session kind of runs itself from there. That's how I tend to like prefer to run games. So, and Maze Arts is pretty good with that, with setting up situations and like missions and objectives and things like that. Because like different PCs want things, different factions want things, and those wants often conflict with each other. Max says, I take a lot from Warhammer. I love how everybody hates everyone else to the point where they'd all work together because they hate someone else even more. Yeah, it's the classic grimdark setting, isn't it? But that's a very old school D&D in the sense that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So it's all about making alliances and getting factions to work with each other and things like that, right? That allows you to really dig into the personalities of the NPCs and like the factions and so on. And that gets you interacting with the world rather than just running around killing things. Munga says, can we expect any more one-page dungeons from you in the future? I was planning on making it a fairly regular thing, and I do want to make more of them. I'm sort of waiting for inspiration to strike. The idea of having reprogrammable golems was like really exciting for me, and I'm glad I made that dungeon. But I'm waiting for like some other big hook to hit me that I think would be cool to make a dungeon around. Definitely keep you guys updated if I think of things. My kids going crazy in the background. Will I be able to watch the live stream from the start? Yeah, absolutely. Once this is done, this is all just going to be recorded and put on YouTube. So anyone can rewatch this in the future. Is the 6 Mile Hex idea explored somewhere else that I can read more? Yeah, so that's basically the idea of the hex crawl. So the hex crawl goes back to the early days of D&D, where maps were broken up into hexagons. So I think in OD&D, there was a game that Gary used called like Wilderness Exploration, I think, which is like a totally separate game and had this big hex map of the wilderness. And he just used that for D&D. And people travel from hex to hex. And having a 6 Mile Hex is quite popular due to the mathematical properties of a 6 Mile Hex. Like if you have a hexagon that's 6 miles from one flat side to the other flat side, then the distance from one corner to the other corner will be 7 miles or very close to 7 miles. And the length of one of the short sides of the hexagon will be like 2.5 miles, almost exactly. So there's a lot of like very pleasing mathematical properties about that are nice. But it's definitely a style of play. I know that what was that recent D&D book, Tomb of Annihilation, does a hex crawl. I'm not sure how big their hexes are, but they have a really huge hex crawl. I haven't heard great things about that. Most people have said that the random encounters and the stuff you find in the hexes tend not to be very interesting. So it's kind of a slog. But definitely setting things up like so the world just exists on its own. The world is just doing its own thing. And then players interact with it, and then things just slowly spiral out of control as players mess up the balance of the world is definitely how I prefer to play, and definitely a hallmark of old school play. You see a lot of people promote that sort of thing in the OSR. Hexes are 10 miles in Tomb of Annihilation. Now that's huge. That is a big hex. A little while ago, I was having a discussion with some people on Google Plus about like the size of 6 Mile Hexes. And the cool thing is that I've been using Google Earth. And what I've been doing is just zooming in on different like famous features and then drawing a 6 Mile Hex on the actual map, because Google Earth comes with features where you can do that. And I found out, for example, like a big mountain like Mount Hood in the Pacific Northwest pretty much fits inside a 6 Mile Hex. And something like the city of Venice, like the medieval city of Venice, is about as wide as a 6 Mile Hex. Like some medieval cities could be quite large. It doesn't take up the whole hex because it's kind of a long and skinny city, but it takes up most of it from side to side. And especially if you go to like the British countryside, where you have a lot of like fields divided into hedgerows, divided by hedgerows, and a lot of the sizes of those fields haven't changed in hundreds of years. So you draw like a big 6 mile hex around it, and you can get a very clear sense for how big that is and like how big a house or a town is within inside that. So that's actually pretty cool. It's a useful exercise to do to get a sense of what the geography of a fantasy world would look like at different scales, because people have a really hard time visualizing that, and Google Earth is a great tool for fixing that. Irvin says regards from Mexico. Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Irvin. Let's have some cities going down along this lake. Maybe these are little fishing villages. And then let's say that you can't have any more villages because there's like a bunch more mountains down here that kind of cut it off. It's good to use mountains and hills and forests and things like that as a way of constraining your map and to force travel like along certain corridors so that players can travel like around the mountains, which is safer but takes longer, or they can cut through the mountains, in which is more dangerous, but in theory there's less distance you have to travel. So just causing players to consider their routes more. Let's put some mountains in all the way down here at the bottom. Let's shift this up a little bit. And let's put some mountains along this side too. Maybe this whole lake was caused by kind of like a rift or a valley between these mountains. I like that idea. So a lot of this is just going really slow and figuring out what you think would look good in this particular area and paying attention that each particular zone has interesting things in it, has interesting routes in and out of it. And you think that you could think of some cool things that could happen there. There we go. Let's add some little ridge lines here. So one viewer says, I used to live on Mount Hood. Oh, cool. Yeah, I've been to Mount Hood a couple times. And you could run an entire campaign just in that 6 mile hex and the 6 hexes around it. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So a lot of people want their campaign world to just be full of, tons of hexes, like you're saying Tomb of Annihilation, which has 10 mile hexes. But a 6 mile hex is really big. It's much bigger than people think it is. And you could definitely have tons of encounters and things happen just inside that. Right. So, for example, the scale on my map is each inch is 10 miles. So if it's 10 miles from there to there, then let's see, a 6 mile hex will be 6 miles across. So about half an inch or so would be the distance across the hex, which looks fairly small. But if you look at the scale of this, you could probably fit, 2 different towns in there and like some hills and a forest. And I mean, you wouldn't have to leave that hex for a long time if you didn't want to. You could pack it full of things. See, any advice to someone looking into Patreon down the road? I mean, you need to, a lot of it has to do with people just wanting to support you. So it's important to basically be providing some sort of service that people want to make sure keeps continuing. I don't feel like I'm any sort of expert on Patreon, to be honest. I'm sure there's some sort of magic trick that I'm not like really aware of. I'm not like a super big success on Patreon, though I'm super grateful to all the people who are supporting me. What I do is every month or so, I have a special hangout, kind of like this one, but just with patrons who are pledging at like the $4 level. And I answer like any questions that they have, and we do like one-on-one chats. I might be doing at some point in the future like actual play test with some of them, and just make sure that you really tell them how much you appreciate them and really demonstrate that. One of my players making a prop at the minute. Has anyone used props in D&D? Yeah, well, I've occasionally done that. The main trick is to make sure that players don't think that you're going to be doing that every time. Otherwise, you get pulled into this thing where you always have to be making props all the time. But some games come with props, like the Hot Springs Island book. Like one of the books is an actual in-world prop that you can give to the players, and they can actually read it and read like all the journal entries. I think that's really cool. Let's shade this in. So does anyone here really into, I need to have a little more ridge, a few more ridges here. Anyone here really into things like Critical Role or any other live streams of D&D? And if so, which ones do you think do the best job? I'm trying to get into Shadow of the Cabal right now, which is a live stream set in Legend of the Five Rings in Rokugan. And I'm pretty much enjoying it, at least so far. I haven't got through the first episode yet. But I like that it's much snappier than Critical Role. And it's edited a lot so that a lot of the banter is taken out, and it sticks pretty closely to just like what the characters are doing and what's happening in the world. So that moves things along much more quickly, and I appreciate that. Like in Critical Role, there's a lot of table banter, which is obviously fine. Everyone's table has a lot of banter. But if you don't know all of the people personally, it's just not that interesting and just slows stuff down. So if the focus is on what's happening in the session, having it edited really does make a difference, I found. Oh yeah, I'm not saying there's anything bad about table banter. I'm absolutely okay with my players chatting about whatever at the table. Metagaming is absolutely fine. I'm just more talking about what would make it enjoyable to listen to, right? From people who don't know you personally. Yeah, a bunch of mountains there. Let's make this less foresty. Let's just make this much more mountainy. So I'm gonna add lots of like little mountains in there, I think. Just to really reinforce how dangerous the terrain is around here. We got a lot of gaps between these mountains that I'm not too happy about. Let's just fill those in. By making them pointier, they won't really seem like hills as much, which is what you want to avoid. Let's just do a little bit of shading there. Weird thing I've noticed in my own gaming is that hex crawls tend to be more fun in person than online. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, hex crawls are fairly complicated because there's a lot of like logistics going on, right? In terms of like where you are and where you want to get to. There's a lot of discussion at the table about what your goals are and what you want to do next because they're so player driven. And that sort of thing I can see not being a ton of fun to listen to. And it's hard to really coordinate that unless you're all just like in the same place. So it might be harder to do that online. There we go. If I can rotate this a little bit. Yeah, let's scoot this down. Maybe I can get a better angle on this. There you go. It's a little better. Let's have like a little village off in these hills. The only way to get there is by traveling south to one of these towns. That's an ugly little village. It's okay. There we go. Has anyone played Pendragon by Chaosium? I have not. I've heard a lot of good things about Pendragon. I'm especially intrigued by the idea that it has this giant long campaign that covers like the entire like 80 years around the time of Arthur, like the whole Arthurian saga. Except the Arthurian saga is happening in the background. Meanwhile, you're just like a knight in Arthur's time, and all these things are happening in the background, and you're having adventures simultaneously. I think that's a really cool idea. It's also interesting in that there are times apparently where you can lose control of your character because you actually have like virtues and flaws. You have like this personality system. And if you get some bad rolls, then your players can like succumb to vices, for example, and they'll just do things even though you don't want them to, which is very story gamey, but it could be a lot of fun. All right, let's have some orchards over here. I'm gonna give something a shot. So one thing I was testing out, I'm gonna pull this other map over here, is that you can also do forests like this, right? Instead of having them all spiky like down here, you just make them a little bit more rounded and they look more like deciduous trees rather than pine trees. So let's see if I can do that. Use a little pen here. Eric Bulgaris. Hey, Eric. I was in a Pendragon game with Stephen Lumpkin and Luke Crane. Oh, cool. Those are some big game designers. Finished the whole first book. Man, that's awesome. I'd love to try that out sometime. You know what? I'm not really feeling it. I don't think we're going to have any trees around there. Let's have like these hills kind of go this way and merge with these mountains. I like that. They're sort of just going in that direction. All right, let's add a little bit of shading to those. Because I don't like having big, empty, blank spots on my map. I like there to be a pretty consistent, fill of interesting things happening. So the terrain is always a factor that players need to consider. Okay, and let's add some more trees kind of going off in that direction too. I'm feeling that these towns are kind of merging into the background a little bit. I wonder if they would look better if they were shaded in or something. Maybe it's just the line width makes them not stand out that much. Not totally sure what it is. Like some of these ones just don't seem to stand out in the way that I would like them to. All about experimentation, trying different stuff. It can be really worthwhile to just do what I did on that other piece of paper and just get a big piece of paper and draw like an outline and start filling in with mountains and, whatever. But trying things tons of different ways, like try to draw forests 5 different ways. Try things you're not sure if they're going to work, right? It's just practice. But you get a really good sense of what's going to work with your style and what isn't. What's everyone's favorite part about playing an RPG? My favorite part about playing an RPG is when players do something that I didn't expect and it was way cleverer and more out of the box than I expected, and they completely circumvented some challenge that I had in their way. That is the absolute best part of playing an RPG for me personally. Sometimes you have other great moments too, like character moments where players are role playing a character and then things just like come together in this perfect way. But those are more rare for me because it totally depends on the group you have. Whereas players getting creative and solving problems in out of the box methods tends to be a lot more common for me. Maybe that's just because OSR games tend to encourage it. But those sorts of moments are really common in OSR games. You sometimes read on Reddit or on Story. There's some subreddit where people just talk about stories from their RPGs. And the top rated ones are always ones like that, where players just got insanely creative and used a spell or an item or just social engineering in a way the GM never expected. And the GM always acts really frustrated that the players are circumventing their prepared plot. But those are always the best stories. Everyone really loves it when players do that because it feels like the players' actions mattered, their creativity mattered, and they feel like badasses because they did what no one thought they could do. Right? The monster was way too tough to actually kill, but they managed to take it down anyway. But those sorts of moments just happen constantly in old school role playing games. In any game, really, where you turn the lethality up really high, so it's really easy to die, and you give players a lot of options and give them a lot of tools, things that they can mess with, and you allow their actions to really have consequences. For whatever reason, suddenly they get really creative, and those moments just start pouring out. That's what I love about it. Let's see. Let's have a bandit camp over there. But why is there a bandit camp there? Probably because there's a road going right by the bandit camp, right? That would make sense. So let's say that there's going to be another town over here. Okay. Because we're not going to have bandits unless they're, trying to take out people going along the road. There. So we're going to have another road coming from here, right past the bandit camp. Let's have a fairly long walk in this direction. We'll have some sort of keep way out there. Abandoned castle, or maybe a populated castle. Who knows? Like a keep out there. So they're guarding the road to that keep. Let's put a little bit of forest on the other side. Let's say that part of the road is going through some part of a forest. Okay. There we go. I like that a lot more. Peter says, I honestly find it most fun to create a new character differently and test it out. Also, I've been theater acting since I was 8, so putting myself in the shoes of the character. Sure. That's definitely a big draw for a lot of players. I really like randomly generating characters because I really like seeing the weirdos that pop out on the other end and having to put together a story or an explanation for why they are the way they are is really fun. I like that element of surprise. In the same way that as a GM, I like rolling on random tables to see like what a town is like or what's nearby or what events are happening. I like being surprised and having to work on the fly to figure it out. Let's see. Do we want to put anything else in here before I wrap up? I feel like this is a pretty interesting area. where we have like hills that are all forested over here, like this long lake going into the mountains. Like there could be things farther along this river that you'd have to travel down in order to find maybe if there's some sort of dungeon hidden down there. But we have a fairly populated area. I feel like there should be another road cutting through here, because these people would want to go directly through there sometimes, directly over to this town. So let's connect these up like that. Gonna have to go around here because these are in the way. And let's have maybe a road going along there to that village. I feel like we have a pretty plausible network of roads with buildings that are all a reasonable walking distance away, right? Around 5 to 10 miles. So doable for anyone traveling by foot. All right, let's wrap it up there. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. This really helps my creative juices get going and help me get started on this map. This is just a tiny portion of this map. Let me zoom out so you can see how big it is compared to the whole map. And this gets a little bit out of focus there, but you can see that the map is quite large, or at least the paper is. So I got a lot more stuff that I can slowly fill in here and create just a plausible groundwork that I can use to fill in for a fantasy campaign. Or see, I don't even have to come up with particular things for each place. I can just create random tables and then generate it as I go. Anyway, thanks for hanging out, guys. Keep an eye out for more videos coming out next week. Let's see, I'm probably going to be doing a couple of videos or a couple of reviews on stuff by the Milzonian Arts Council, which is a great little OSR publisher. They have something called Fever Swamp, which is a miniature hex crawl. So those of you interested in that hex crawl idea, you're going to want to check out this book. It's really interesting. It's very short, very compact, but it makes the hex crawl very easy to use. So you explore this crazy swamp that has all sorts of diseases and monsters and interesting encounters that you can check out. Yeah. And if you enjoyed this, if you're watching this at some point in the future, you can always subscribe to my channel and check out more map making videos. And you can join me on Patreon if you want to support me making this sort of thing. Like I said, me and my patrons hang out once a month, and we do private videos like this where we talk about whatever we want to talk about, including play testing or RPG design or what have you. So thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you guys later.